If you've met a Christian, I'm sure at some point you've wondered, does this person I'm talking to believe that I have a choice in what I'm doing? Or that my soul is going up or down no matter what I do? Well, let's talk about that. I'm Valdo, and it's late. If you couldn't tell by the lighting or my eye bags, it's probably a little past your bedtime, and it's way past my bedtime, which means it's the perfect time to panic. The perfect time to ask, what's the point of all of this? Humanity, my life, anything, entropy, whatever, physics. So, is my free will real? Or is it all just predestined? Ooh, let's ask. I'm gonna hope you don't miss my face too much, because we're going to be looking at this chart, this beautiful, wonderful chart, for the rest of the video. And just in case you're at this point wondering, why is this even important? Well, just as a little side tangent, the entirety of the modern public school system here in the West was based off of the philosophy of Calvinists, people who believed in radical monergism, meaning they took into account the predestination of human behavior. And on the other end, over in Eastern Europe, many of the law codes were built by people who believed more synergistic perspectives on human behavior and how they anticipated human free will was going to play out. So these things do matter on a very practical and utilitarian level as well. And before we take a look at both ends of this architecture, it's important to remember that human destiny, in the way that the modern world and the Western world have been historically thought of, were in terms of salvation, in terms of unity with God, the kingdom of heaven, all that kind of stuff. So let's go. So on two ends, we have monergism and synergism. And this is the spectrum that these free will and predestination beliefs fall on across Christianity. Do you believe that your salvation is monergistic, meaning it only takes the energy of one being, usually God, to achieve your salvation? Or do you believe that salvation is synergistic, meaning it takes both you and God working together to make you holier and to bring you into the fullness of what he intends for your life? How much sovereignty does God have over the universe and you specifically? And how much free will and autonomy do you have? It's a good question. A lot of questions that have been asked throughout Christian history. Both angles of this debate are each using scripture and trying to understand how this relationship works, because there are verses that say free will, blah, 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 and there are verses that say predestination, blah, blah, blah. The early Christians didn't see any contradiction in this, and they just didn't have a big focus on it. It was only later that making an exact system out of it was seen as prudent and necessary. You might have noticed that strange term on the top of the chart, soteriology, and that basically means the science of salvation, the system, how does it all work? Something that surprised me when I first learned about it is that these debates are not talked about in terms of your future or your past, so much as they are talked about in terms of how trapped is your behavior in sin, in the things that are not aligned with God's purposes, in the things that misfire what is holy and good, One thing you may have noticed is that I made the predestination side of this debate purple to represent God's sovereignty, and I made the free will side red to represent how the blood of Jesus gives us freedom, that kind of thing. And I'll briefly tell you that for the first 400 years of church history, most people were synergistic. Then, after Augustine in the 400s, most people went monergistic, in the West anyway. And then throughout the High Middle Ages, up until the Reformation, it was kind of a middle ground. And then during the Reformation, a lot of people swung monergistic again, especially in the West. The East has mostly been synergistic throughout its entire history. Many modern-day evangelicals have also brought the Protestant conversation in the West back towards synergism somewhat in the last couple hundred years. But we'll get more into the specifics on that later. Starting on the radical end of monergism, we have this philosophy I'm going to call occasionalism. Some people would call it hyper-Calvinism. It's really not very popular in Christian circles. Sometimes it's popular in philosophical circles, but it's completely considered heresy by almost all Christians. The basic idea is that God's going to do whatever he wants, and sometimes this can lead to the idea that there's not much of a point in evangelizing or bringing certain types of good into the world because God's going to do whatever he wants anyway. There are schools of Islamic philosophy that would greatly sympathize with this viewing because they view God as voluntarist. He can do whatever he wants because that's how cosmically powerful he is, while most views of the Christian God say that the physical universe and what we do and the goodness we bring out of it are natural consequences of who God is. So in practical terms, a voluntarist God who practices occasionalism might be able to contradict himself in certain ways. He can create a rock heavier than he can lift, whereas most Christian interpretations of God would say that he cannot contradict himself. God cannot create a rock heavier than he can lift. Next, we are on to my Calvinist friends. So first, I will say, while I would hesitate to call you heterodox, the vast majority of Christians would definitely call you heterodox, especially the Catholics. Heterodoxy is not outright heresy. It's not right, oh, your salvation is done for, but it is like, whoa there, buddy, you're dealing with some dangerous ground. Anyway, let's move on. Calvinism is often compatible with determinism. Occasionalism is more towards the fatalist side of things, where you can't affect anything, can't do anything. Calvinism, yes, God regenerating your energy and bringing you into his salvation, that's still only a one-way street, one-way process, but you can still do things outside of that dynamic that affect your trajectory in life. I know it's kind of cheap and kind of typical, but we're going to go through the 5 points of TULIP, which is the general summary of how to understand it. So, total depravity, everybody, all humanity is depraved. Then unconditional election, there are no conditions for God choosing you and enlightening you. Limited atonement, God is only going to pass over and save a certain amount of people. Irresistible grace, once God's got you, he's got you. And perseverance of the saints, which is that once he's got you, he's not going to let you go, and you can't let go. That's it. You may have noticed that I put this strange term supralapsarianism under the word Calvinism. The Calvinists, the Reformed tradition, they love these big words. They love them because they like to make sure that they have all their philosophy down. They have a system for everything. So supralapsarianism I often find to be compatible with a straightforward reading of TULIP and a straightforward reading of the Reformed doctrine. Basically, supralapsarianism says that the universe was created for the purpose of Jesus Christ's incarnation into our physical world, and so everything that's happened before and after that was a trajectory to get to that point, to get to the redemption that Christ brings to the physical world and to humanity. And while other traditions and other systems have this as a component, supralapsarianism has it as the centerpiece that cannot be avoided or tiptoed around, which means humanity's fate was there's no getting around the fact that humanity's fate was decided before the beginning of time and after the end of time. You can't do nothing, son. Sorry. It's all God's righteousness, and none of your work goes into your saving faith in God's grace. And I'll invite you to get into the mindset of a Calvinist real quick, because if God really is beyond space and time, the creator of everything that ever was and ever will be, then of course wouldn't you just be a character on a stage play, as Calvin notes. Only the source of goodness is worthy of being the definition of good itself. I'm not going to keep going. Next point. Amoraldianism or amoraldianism. You know what? I'm not even going to make you remember this term, because really it's a subset of Calvinism that tends to fluctuate and grow and shrink in popularity. Calvinism in general has its foundations in the Dark Ages, when St. Augustine comes forward with a more monergistic perspective on salvation. It grows over time. There's a Catholic guy named Duns Scotus, and eventually it flourishes into a full system during the Protestant Reformation. As you can imagine, Calvinism is a primarily Protestant idea, and so is this one, Almoraldianism. And one way that it manifests, I would say, is with infralapsarianism, another fun, complicated term. But first I'll say, on the surface level, its key distinction is that it says, no, Calvinism, the atonement is not limited, the atonement is for all people. And so it takes a much softer angle on how God's monergism affects humanity. And as a result, most people who subscribe to this line of thinking tend to be infralapsarian. And those terms, they can switch in and out, but I'm just going to keep going with this train of thought to keep it simple. Basically, the idea is, hey, God anticipates humanity's fall first, and then Christ is part of the game plan to fix that. And so our willpower and our ability to be autonomous from our mistakes or from God's glory, there's a slightly more wiggle room in understanding how that works. Thomism. Next, Thomism, a beast, a behemoth, a Goliath of Christian thought. This man, Thomas Aquinas, was a Catholic medieval theologian. He was not appreciated in his day and age. In fact, he was quite hated by most Catholics at the time. But later on, he came to be a core pillar of their theology in general. And he has this massive work called the Summa Theological and many other massive works. And the guy starts out as kind of a systematic theologian, and he ends his career more as a mystic. And as you can imagine, he has incredibly complicated ideas about how free will and how God's overpowering energy in your life works. But the basic way that I'll break it down is that God is constantly guiding you, but to some degree, he needs your cooperation to get things done. Now we are here in the middle. I'm going to call this idea the formula of concord, because there's no real term for it. Like maybe you'll hear Lutherans call it monergism, but yeah, as you can tell, it's a mainly Lutheran idea. It's a Protestant idea, and it's very mystical. Most Lutherans will try to avoid explaining how God works because they don't believe that we should be trying to categorize the way that that relationship happens through firm philosophy or systematic ties or whatever. So the easiest way I can explain it is only God can choose us, and only man can forsake God. And that's why I put it here in the middle, because it has an equal balance of both a monergistic and synergistic worldview, I think. Now we move on to Arminian theology. I am personally an adherent of Arminian theology, and so, this hits a little close to home for me. But Arminius was a gentleman in the Reformed tradition, in the scholastic group that believed in Calvinism, and he reassessed scripture and history and tradition and the Reformed theologians' words and meaning as basically saying, well, actually, all this predestination is actually God's foreknowledge. Ooh. Arminianism also has 5 points, which preceded the Calvinist ones, but we're not going to go into all that. The idea starts with, yes, we are totally depraved, actually, or at least we are depraved enough that we cannot loosen our chains of sin on our own. We need God's prevenient grace to come into our lives in unconscious patterns and in unforeseen ways that slowly awakens us to who and what God is. And then we are awakened enough that we can autonomously choose whether to return to our sin or to embrace Christ. At that point, we enter what's called justifying grace. The Lutherans love this justifying grace stuff. It is where we are imputed grace by Christ because he declares us righteous before God the Father. Then we enter what is called sanctifying grace, where we synergistically work together with God to become holier and more like Christ over the course of our lives. Arminian theology is a view held by the Methodists, who have made their own innovations on it and popularized it, as well as the Pentecostals, who came from the Methodists, and a significant amount of the Baptists. They fluctuate back and forth between having this view and having a more Calvinistic view. The Anglicans do too, actually. They're sometimes closer to Arminianism, and sometimes they're closer to Calvinism. But yeah, that's the cheese, dog. I feel like it's a helpful time to remind you that even though some of these systematic theologies only arose after and at the end of the medieval age, that the vast majority of what composes them are sharpened and more sophisticated tools that have been refined over time from much earlier. Next, we have Molinism. Molinism is a big position in the Catholic Church as well, kind of like Thomism. Molinism has a very different conversation about how you should look at free will. It basically says God has middle knowledge. Ooh, what does that mean, God has middle knowledge? So there's a reality of all things that could possibly exist, the variables in the universe, and God in his mind has a world in which all necessary things exist. And it's all very philosophical and high-minded, and I'm not going to shove it down your throat and make you choke on it. The basic idea is these two realities meet at what is middle knowledge, which is our physical universe, a world where both necessary things exist and perhaps possible variants of that thing, which allows for human free will to manifest. There are necessary truths and there are contingent truths, and they have a very complicated relationship that I'm not going to force you to listen to right now. Kind of cool, kind of strange. Yeah. We are once again entering into heterodox territory, meaning most Christians who don't believe in this consider it, maybe you shouldn't be there, But the people who practice it will call this view synergism. However, outsiders will call it Massilianism. Is that what am I saying that right? Or semi-Pelagianism. Ooh, very fancy. We're going to get to full-on Pelagianism in a minute, so right now I'm just going to explain this worldview. So synergism, which is an evolution of the early church view that you work together with God to achieve your salvation. Basically, it says that Yes, there is sin in your life, but it's not an overwhelming force that's going to trap you. It's more like a gravitational orbit in nature. Sometimes it accumulates and everybody's going to drift towards it. But you as a human have enough innate goodness in you and in your purpose and in your moral compass that you don't need God to be the first mover in your life to choose him. You can actually choose God first. But salvation still doesn't happen without God. This is why it's not considered heresy. Because even after you do the first choosing of God, you still have to cooperate with God in order for him to save you. And that's where the synergism comes into play. The Eastern Orthodox very explicitly articulate this worldview, and the Oriental Orthodox Church, as well as the Nestorians or the Assyrian Church of the East, also practice something very similar to this, that they would, I think, also call synergism. But for ease of the chart, we're going to call it this other thing that I wrote down. Something that should be noted is that many evangelicals whose churches on paper will affirm Arminian doctrine actually in reality practice semi-Pelagianism. And also, many so-called restorationist Christians will adhere to a view kind of similar to what you're about to hear in full-on Pelagianism. Now, we have reached Pelagianism. Ooh. Basically, there was this guy, Pelagius, early medieval times, and he said, you know what, guys, I think that most humans are good enough to not even need God, or at least we can achieve our salvation on our own. It sounds pretty cool, right? And the entire Latin church and all the other churches said, no, actually, no, it's not. No, sorry, no. And to get you to look at this from a more cosmic angle to understand the seriousness of this worldview, it basically says that mankind has the ability to bridge the gap between the physical and spiritual world by himself. He doesn't need God. He doesn't need anything from the spirit world to make the first move when it comes to human autonomy or space and time or your nature or any of that stuff. You can just ascend to a higher reality on your own because you've achieved that through your works. And as much as I would like to talk about what I would call ultra-Pelagianism, which is Zoroastrian soteriology, that has nothing to do with this video. So we'll talk about that another time. You'll love it. Don't worry, you'll love it. My second to last note on this wonderful journey that we've been on, thank you for joining me, by the way, is that technically I haven't been fully honest with you about monergism and synergism, because technically Pelagianism, as it only requires humanity's energy, is monergistic, and Calvinism, as they would describe it, has God's energy igniting your energy, and so that's also technically synergistic and not monergistic. And it's long, it's complicated. This is easier. Let's just look at the chart. Chart's easier. Yay, you're welcome. Thank you again for joining me. Please like and subscribe, and comment if you want more information on this kind of stuff or if you want less. Haters welcome. Please let me know. All right. Well, it's late, and I love most of you, and I'm gonna go get some shut-eye now. So have a good night. Remember that this stuff is important in how humans view hope and fate and destiny and depravity and death and all that kind of thing. And it's also important to how we've historically organized as humans and as societies. It's pretty cool if you look into it. So I've been Valdo, and I look forward to seeing some new and different content. We're going to have a smorgasbord. It's going to be awesome. Have a good night.